Well, thank you very much, Noda, for very kind words and a very useful summary of how we find ourselves here. It's always I lived in the States now for 26 years, and it's always a treat to be back in Britain and back with my friends at CARE, and particularly a treat to be encouraged to think further about what I think is one of the great questions, and perhaps the great question of the 21st century, which is how we will manage with our machines as our machines become increasingly like us. Let me give a couple of contexts for my interest in this discussion. I'm not a roboticist, I'm not a technologist. My background was in theology and philosophy. I got into bioethics many years ago. Decided about 20 years ago that probably talking about bioethics was not the most useful thing I could do with my time. Talking about technology policy would give me access to the same conversations at a higher level and involving people who thought ethics was a sort of a hobby for ethicists, and in fact engage in precisely the same conversation, because every discussion about technology and policy is a discussion about human values. And that led me into developing a center in a university context, initially in the US, in Chicago, at the Illinois Institute of Technology, and subsequently developing with some colleagues this project in Washington, D.C. as a think tank on technology policy. You raise the policy question, and then you have the ethics discussion. The second taproot, if you like, of my interest in these questions goes back much further. I remember back in, well, around 1980, I suppose, watching Michael Crichton's wonderful movie, Westworld, which of course subsequently has been given a new lease of life in this television series, which I'm sure many of you have watched, which takes forward his basic idea. I was privileged to meet Mike Crichton several times. He died tragically at a relatively young age a few years back. Fascinating man. At one point, in the same week, he had the top grossing movie, Jurassic Park, he had the top TV show, and the best-selling book, the same week. And I once introduced him to a group of senators on Capitol Hill, and his opening, we were talking about intellectual property and human genes. That was the topic of that and he began the conversation with, "I own a lot of intellectual property." And it interests me, the vision of that man in writing that movie, Westworld, back in 1979, was it came out, something like that, when he was really very young, and foreseeing the development of humanoid robotics and exploring some of the questions raised. Now, the Westworld series, many of you will have seen on television, takes these things much further. But so another taproot of my interest in this discussion was the impact of that film, which I've never forgotten, and which I have subsequently viewed more than once. A third relates specifically to the issue of employment, which I think probably has opened my interest in the whole robotics agenda much more widely. And I was sharing in the discussion we had with John Cruddas and others in Parliament yesterday, one or two of the experiences that I've had that got me into these conversations. I was sitting down with two top lawyers in Silicon Valley having lunch in Menlo Park. A very charming restaurant. I remember it was one of these, where they open up the front, so you're half inside, half outside. And being Silicon Valley, the number 2 partner in this big law firm owned a vineyard. I mean, you keep bumping into people there who own vineyards. This is what you do if you're out there. I kind of felt I was missing something by not owning one myself. And so we had to order his wine. And I was there trying to get money out of these people to help my think tank. That wasn't the conversation they had in mind. And the senior partner just began by saying, what we would like to know is when we'll be involved in funding a company which will be creating jobs and not destroying jobs. That was their question. And that really sent me on a sort of a trek of the issue of robotics and job, which ended up in the other little book which was published this year, which is specifically on robotics and employment. And led me into conversations with people in the trade union movement, with people in governments, both here in London, in the US. I was in Canada last year, and asking the question why people in government don't raise these questions at a high level. And to his credit, of course, Mr. Corbyn recently raised this question at a high level in two different speeches, the issue of robotics and employment, which I think may be a world first. And I think it's interesting that London is the place these things are beginning to bubble to the surface. So a number of reasons why I found myself engaging in this discussion of the impact of robotics and AI, and the fact that the robots really are coming, which led to my invitation from CARE to write the little book, the one with the pictures, which are certainly the best bit of the book, but there is text there also for those who have the time. And what I've sought to do in the book at a popular level is to raise in several different ways the questions which the robot revolution are bringing to the fore, both by looking at the history of robotics, of course, and this is not a new idea. People since the ancient world have been trying to replicate human activity in all sorts of ways through machines, both in terms of the word robot, which of course comes from a play. It's a made-up word. It isn't a French word like a lot of people seem to think. It isn't robo, it's robot, and it comes from a Czech word for slave labor, an interesting concept, from a play from the 1920s. Looking at the concept of the dignity of work, using George Herbert's wonderful poem about work, work under God, teach me, my God and King, in all things thee to see, as a kind of a heuristic, and seeking out what it means for us to work. And also reflecting, of course, on the fact that it may be we will not be having much work to do in the future, and what that might mean, which I think is something that I certainly want to research and write and think a lot more about, perhaps as the next thing that I turn my own pen to. So for a number of these reasons, I've ended up spending the last 2 or 3 years focusing particularly on the robotics question and the issues it raises. And as Nola said in her introduction, one would have thought that because those of us who are Christians, as certainly are some in this room, and I'm not necessarily all, those of us who are Christians, and indeed those within the other great monotheistic faiths, we have a sense of what it means to be human. We believe to be humans to be made in the divine image. We believe, we go back to the book of Genesis, we're very early on, we get our marching orders. We're here to rule the earth, to take responsibility, to be stewards. And of course, this explains the whole story of, man, the tool maker, Homo faber. We make things, and from very early days, humans have made things, have made tools, and have used tools to leverage their activities. This is what tools are for. It enables us to do human things more effectively. And just as now, if you want to, put in a screw or something, you use a screwdriver, and it does a thing you could probably do with your fingers, but it would be much more difficult, and you wouldn't do it so well. Tools have always enabled humans to do human things more effectively. And one of the questions we face as we confront the notion of tools which are of another order of magnitude in the application of AI, machine terms, whether robots that look like robots or whether simply in the systems, which we become very familiar with, AI algorithm-driven systems, is whether this new level of tool making on the part of Homo sapiens, on the part of those who bear the image of God, is something fundamentally different to what it was before. And I'm reminded of words of the great C.S. Lewis. Lewis seems to haunt pretty much every serious conversation one has. There's very little that we can talk about that he really hadn't anticipated in his quite extraordinary way. His little essay, The Abolition of Man, some of you will know. If despite the efforts of the Lewis trustees, who are guardians par excellence of his intellectual property beyond the grave, you can get on the internet pretty easily. It's only about 6 pages long. Little essay written in 1943, which I think one could say is one of the most consequent things written in the 20th century, where he foresees the impact of these technologies, specifically talking about human enhancement. But his essay just drips with wisdom, such as, if I can grasp this from memory, man's conquest of nature is part of his theory here. And he says, actually, this is not man's conquest. This is the use of nature by some men to exercise power over other men, which of course captures precisely the role of technology and of capital, of course, in the modern world. in that it is not that we're confronting nature in some new way, it is that these extraordinarily powerful tools we are creating are giving to some people extraordinary capacities to exercise leverage over other people. And this may be good, this may be bad, but it is of a completely fresh order. And whether you're thinking here about the algorithms powering Facebook, some of you may have seen a very fine piece by Alexis Madrigal, the American technology writer, in Atlantic Monthly just about 3 or 4 days ago, about the extraordinary manner in which algorithms are driving Facebook to control our thinking and our activities, as well as our purchasing and so on. Or whether you're thinking about these mechanical systems and the way in which they're going to be able to enable us to have, like the Roomba does your hoovering for you, but as you build up on this, household helps, and already in Dubai they have robotic policemen. I mean, look like robots driving around the place. Whichever of these systems you're talking about, and there are many different kind of AI-driven systems. The extent to which this is blessing and curse, plainly it is both. And it's also, and I think I have this a slide in the book with the pictures, it is also fundamentally confusing. And clarifying what is going on is certainly a prerequisite if we're going to get into a serious discussion of the rights and the wrongs and what we would like to happen and not to happen as the near future begins to unfold. Well, one or two particular comments about what I think is happening. There are maybe 3 categories which concern me here. The first, to get it out of the way, if you like, is the jobs question, which potentially is certainly as big as global warming or anything else out there. We don't know. The argument of my little jobs book is that we don't know, and that's the problem. And you draw a risk matrix, and plainly, the impact, if we end up essentially shifting the labor as a substituting capital for labor as a factor of production. And of course, there are presently thousands of people, some of the world's smartest people, paying huge amounts of money in universities and companies all over the world precisely tasked with doing just that, precisely that, substituting capital through technology for labor. If the effect of this is to end the notion of what we call full employment, which is a very curious notion, and there's no economic rule that determines we get full employment. This is why you have governments wrestling all the time with trying to keep the economy going in a way which produces full employment. If this is the end of full employment, then we face a sort of social as well as economic revolution, which raises very profound questions, pretty much all the way from security through to existential questions of meaning, through to plainly economic issues about how you pay people, how you have demand in an economy where people aren't working, and you go on forever. Now, we don't know if that is the future. And the general view has been that people who suggest that could be the future are Luddites. This is the, the L word, the long 4-letter word for people who raise questions like this. There was a classic example of this, which I hope you'll find amusing. You probably all know the name of Elon Musk, who is the somewhat eccentric genius behind Tesla cars, these amazing new big batteries that they're making, partly for the cars, partly for homes. SpaceX, his space rocket company, and he now has this Hyperloop thing, which Branson has now jumped in with, which is a sort of blowpipe approach to transportation. And he also has a thing called the Boring Company. He thinks our cities should all be reconfigured so all the roads are underground. And he now, of course, has a company which is doing this, coming up with novel approaches to deep boring tunnels. Well, Elon Musk. He is arguably the Thomas Edison of our day, the great inventor across all these fields. Well, in Washington, the most prominent think tank on technology is not the one I've been associated with. It's one called the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, ITIF, run by Michael Rob Atkinson, whom I know and collaborated with from time to time and admire him. He's an economist. And they decided to nominate a Luddite of the Year award. Of course, it's a great way to get a press release out there, and one has ways of doing these things. And whom do they pick? For their first awardee, they pick Elon Musk. And of course they get great press for this, because he dared to sign on to this letter, which people like Stephen Hawking and Bill Gates, others signed on to about 3 years ago, saying that AI really could be a problem down the line. AI could go rogue and take over things. And be concerned about it. Partly because of that letter, now a number of projects in Cambridge and elsewhere are being funded to look into this problem and come up with approaches to AI which are non-ambitious and so on. I mean, this has helped to generate quite a lot of serious research. However, ITIF reckoned that because he signed this, he's Luddite of the Year, he wants to slow progress. And the technology enthusiasts love to pose this as a binary question. Either you believe that these technologies should be encouraged to advance without raising any serious issues, or you're a Luddite and you want to close them down. And as ever, it is in the middle ground that both wisdom and ultimately sane policy are going to lie. And the middle ground is where I think we should be having this conversation. But I think a very striking example of the problem of raising difficulties. And of course, more recently, there's been a sign-on letter about automated weapons, which also Musk has signed, as cautions are being raised about the runaway application of this technology. So first of all, we have the work question. Secondly, we have the care question. And my colleague Matt James, who will be involved later in today's event, authored a very interesting report coming out of a biocenter project, specifically on the care of the elderly and the application of robotics. We had a number of events in Parliament and elsewhere. Some of you will have been involved with them a couple of years ago. And the specific question of care of the elderly, I wrote a column. Part of my life I now work with this website Unheard, and I did a weekly column on technology, and I did one on this, picked up the report and talked more generally about robots and the vulnerable. Because already we have this famous, robot Paro being used with the elderly. The NHS is funding this in this country. So you give these old people this sort of seal-like soft toy which plays with them highly intelligently at the cost of several £1,000s a shot. And the basic idea seems to be that the care, particularly the care of the dementing elderly, is a huge problem. It's enormously expensive. There are going to be more and more of us. We're all going to get out there at some point. And it's a very unrewarding, sort of difficult, and so machines will do these things for us. And you begin with a fluffy seal, but there are many other devices in use and many others in development. But of course, on the other end of the scale, you have the care of children, which is also a problem in a society in which now basically most adults work, but we still tend to have children. And the Japanese, who tend to be in the lead on a lot of these things, and Japanese particularly have been in the lead on the whole humanoid question, the human-looking robot question. They have been forging ahead here too, and it's very interesting work they're doing now, developing humanoids to take care of small children. And the basic model they have is government program. They want to have a humanoid robot who's a sort of little thing with a sort of squidgy, funny face. And the idea is that 60 children, preschool children, can be taken up by one human and 4 of these machines. Of course, the machines are great. I mean, they know the children's names. They can sort of, read their features and their pulses and know much more about how they're responding to things. They can send real-time reports back to their parents. I mean, all this stuff is much, much better than humans can do. And you have a human around to sort of keep tabs on things. And one of my column was, this is a pretty fundamental question. Do we really want the most vulnerable members of our society at the beginning and end of life cared for ultimately by machines? Because I think there's no question this is the way things are moving. And if you don't want that to happen, then you've got to start talking about it now. Because economically, it's a no-brainer. Japan, they have a big crisis. They can't recruit people to take care of children. So it's a big economic driver to having machines instead. So my second area, if you like, first of all, jobs. Secondly, this issue of the vulnerable and the ease with which we can use machines to take care of those who are vulnerable. And whereas things like Paro, are the worst, that somebody who has early stage dementia or is just kind of a little old and out of it, might mistake this for a pet. It's a sort of petoid, unlikely to mistake it for a human being. Of course, when you move up the scale and you can produce humanoids who will care for patients in other ways, then of course there can be complete mistake. as you think that this person you're playing, drafts with or who's reading to you actually is a person, because it presents as a person. So that's the second category. The third category, if you like, is the basic one, the one we might call the existential category. Go back to Westworld. How many of you seen the Westworld, the movie, the original actual movie? That's actually pretty impressive, although most of you should be embarrassed because you should have seen it too. But thank you for 4 people who are, on the ball here today. It's pretty rudimentary at one level. You have these sort of theme park, as we now call them, and there are 3 of them out there, but one of them is called Westworld, and people go on vacation there, holiday there. And it's the Wild West, and you can shoot people, and the guns are sort of, organized so that they won't really shoot people. They'll only shoot these robots. The blood temperature or something will stop the gun shooting you. So you can shoot the robots. And of course, there's also a brothel. So you can shoot, and you can also do other things. That's the setup. And these guys, they're going out there for a sort of fun time, and they're just not entirely happy. You can see their mind. They just, well, really, is this okay? And at one point in the brothel, or sort of morning after, I remember this, it's years since I've seen the film, the guy is talking to the robot and sort of saying something, trying to get her to engage in some sort of personal conversation, about her situation, as a robot. Now, that's one of the big themes picked up in the TV version of this, which, of course, makes the whole thing much more engaging week after week after week. The existential questions, they're there, posed then. Of course, the fun thing in Westworld is Yul Brynner plays the gunslinger, and he goes rogue, and it gets pretty scary. It raises, of course, very clearly these 2 different existential experiences. The sexual experience and also the killing experience. And is it just fine to kill robots that look like humans? Is this just okay? Is this just sport? And of course, sex robots are now a big industry. This is going to be bigger and bigger and bigger. How do we as humans respond? And again, I was with a computer science professor recently. He says these are machines. They're just machines. Don't worry about it. Well, some of us talking earlier, there was this Boston Dynamics this little video of these big animal-like robots being knocked over and kicked around, just to show how clever they were, because they can get up again and so on. And this went viral, and people were horrified by this, about mistreating the robots. Because we anthropomorphize, or we dogomorphize, or whatever it is we're doing, we feel queasy when we see these machines being knocked about, because these machines behave in all sorts of ways like we behave, and they seem partly to be like us. And this is pretty primitive-looking machines that are all wires and things. And I remember, for example, Wilberforce, whom we laud for all sorts of reasons, mainly because of his role with the slave trade. But he also was one of the founders of the RSPCA. And it wasn't just because he liked animals, or he did like animals. It was partly because he realized that how people treat animals will tell you a lot about how they will treat people. And if you like children, you don't really care about animals, you should still want people to treat animals well. So that one of the sort of trajectories into the discussion of our relationship with humanoid robots as they become increasingly human is precisely this one. It is that if you believe it's appropriate to maltreat these machines, what is it saying about your approach to treating people? And of course, to put this in theological terms, we're made in the image of God. We're basically creating machines in our image, which thereby reflect the image of God at one remove. Which isn't to say that they have some sort of eternal significance or souls or anything, although who knows? I don't know what God's plans are for smart robots down the line. I don't want to prejudge, what he has in mind. I don't think he's been taken aback by any of this. I think he's rather amused to see us struggling with these issues. But how we treat those whom we have created to look like ourselves. It's a bit like, take a child's toy, and, a child who takes pleasure in destroying a doll or destroying a teddy bear. This tells you something about this child that you probably don't find very, very happy to know. Because these are all ultimately moral questions, how we deal with these images of ourselves. So the existential question of how we respond, and some of you will know that there's a discipline now called affective computing, brilliant scientist who actually is a Christian at MIT called Ros Picard, wrote a book called Affective Computing 15 years ago. And she has a company called Affectiva. And it's all about computer-human relationships that actually go at an emotional level, a psychological level. And it's partly because, autistic children are happier being counseled by a computer than they are by a person. I mean, there are people who fit better into that environment. Quite a lot of people who are not autistic actually prefer confessing to a computer and getting counsel. I mean, this is already going on. This is not, this substitution in jobs isn't just at low-level stuff. There's also some high-level stuff here. But what are we doing when we're having a relationship with a machine? And of course, there have been a couple of movies now about people basically falling in love with, Siri-type voices. This is a non-trivial question. This is my basic point. It's a non-trivial question. I don't think it's simple to say these are just machines, and therefore it doesn't matter how we treat them, how we respond to them. I think in a society, like if you like the Westworld society, in which we have humanoids, perhaps not of the imaginatively high level as those, because those are played by actors and actresses, but the more advanced these machines get, the more complex they get, the more intuitive they become. I think the more problematic it is going to be to decide how it is we can properly relate to them. Some of you will know Spielberg's film A.I., which I thought in many ways was a pretty bad film. But the effects were terrific, and the one part of them that I stayed with me was with the fairground, and some of you know the film. Well, how many have seen A.I. Artificial Intelligence? Same guys, thank you very much. Pretty much, yeah. You people need to get out to the cinema, because that's where all the moral discussion of these questions has been. It certainly hasn't been in the church; it's been in the cinema. Yeah? Where people throw away their clapped out robots, and they all live wild because they can sort of function in the trees and the jungle and so on, and they live and die there. And so people collect them up for fun activities in a fairground like the Roman arena, and they destroy them for fun. This fair, and of course one of them is the little robot whom we knew about from beforehand, and therefore we're all engaged with this process. And these are all pretty clapped out, very machine-y looking robots. And the whole thing is really seriously horrific. And it's when you get into this sort of narrative context that you begin to be drawn into the fact that those who image the image of God at one remove may be worthy of something other than merely machine treatment. So I said there are three categories of concerns that I have: the employment question, whether we'll have things to do with ourselves and how we'll manage those transitions, the vulnerable question, the care of the elderly and the young. I think these are very pressing. These are very much today questions. This is already taking place. And then thirdly, and fundamentally, the existential question of how we relate to these machines as they become increasingly like us. Now, I mean, just to draw to a conclusion, those of us who are Christians believe we're made in the image of God, believe God has given us responsibility to rule over the earth, and in a way, plainly, which is responsible to Him. It isn't a naive rule we have been given. And the making of tools began a long time ago, and in one sense is merely continuous in this situation. And yet the opportunities that these new tools are offering us to exercise influence not only over nature but over other people are just immense. And you know some of the throwaway statistics, the Moore's law statistics. What is it that this little thing we have in our pockets is 1 trillion times as powerful as the world's largest computer in 1960. It's 1 billion times as powerful as the computers that sent men to the moon. And of course, we use it to sort of find the way to the bus stop. We're remarkably incurious. We have access to all the world's knowledge, and what do we use it for? Well, not very much. But this sort of power put into these technologies, which enable us to exercise influence over others, and particularly those in these major companies and of course in governments who can use these technologies. The kind of responsibility which comes with that kind of power is absolutely immense. A couple of practical conclusions. I was asked at the meeting we had Westminster yesterday, sort of what I would suggest we actually do here in the policy context. And I said, well, I thought here in London, Britain, you need a Royal Commission to begin to unpack the agenda. And one of the things very interesting about the report that Matt James put together for Biocentre was it was a scoping document. It was looking at what are the questions we're going to have to address in the care of the elderly and the implications of robotics. So it seems to me a Royal Commission would be one way to do this at a political level, but within churches, within denominations, within various sort of religious networks, it's a scoping question is the first question. What are the kinds of issues here we need to address? We cannot rush to judgment. We don't know, I don't know the answer to most of these questions at all. Every time I'm involved with this kind of conversation, I think I know another question or two, which is progress. But coming up with an agenda in which we begin to see what the questions are seems to be the place to begin. But doing so in a way which is realistic, and I'm very glad we're going to be hearing quite a bit today about what actually is going on in the wider world out there. Because it isn't that tomorrow morning we're going to find Westworld-type humanoids, living in the house next door. At the same time, these developments are going pretty fast, and if you go to conferences and you meet people working on these things, you realize that some extraordinarily clever people with enormous economic motivation behind them are working very hard on this. So I mean, my project prediction is 15 years. There will be no human drivers of taxis or lorries. They just won't be. This will all be automated. I think that's a very reasonable projection. Latest report from PricewaterhouseCoopers, not a well-known Luddite think tank, a few months ago, many of you will have seen this, basically endorsed the notion it's 30 to 40% of jobs gone in 15 years. This is not very far out. This stuff is happening fast, and therefore, whether we're concerned about the existential question underlying this, whether we're concerned about the vulnerable, or whether we're concerned about the jobs agenda primarily, these issues are moving fast up the Moore's Law curve, and I'm delighted that CARE has drawn us together today to think a little bit about what the Church should be making of it all. Thank you very much.